Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hello, Sandy. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the US and really around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to help transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experiences and our knowledge in the hope of inspiring leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
Today, we want to focus on a body of research that really informs how we understand trauma informed practice, and it's called terror management theory.
Yeah, I first saw the book about terror management theory. It came out after 9/11, which was entirely appropriate. But what we think is that the evolution of the human brain led to two particularly human intellectual capacities. One being a high degree of self-awareness, and the other one, the capacity to think in terms of the past and the present and the future. So as far as we know, because we don't know, we can't get inside the minds of other animals, but only we humans seem to be aware of ourselves as existing in a particular time and place, which is, has a lot of really cool things about it, but there is a downside. And the downside is that we all know we are going to die. Death awareness, also called mortality salience,
Yes.
that is particularly human.
And it's really interesting. It almost feels like a cosmic joke, right? This intelligence that we have to be able to see the past and the present and think about the future. Um, it actually presents us with a pretty appalling predicament. On one hand, we share the intense desire for continued existence, like all living things. But on the other hand, we're smart enough to recognize that that's not a thing. Death is actually inevitable. And so we pay a pretty heavy price for being this self conscious and aware.
Yeah, we have to hope that now everybody didn't just turn off our podcast because we're talking about something that people don't really want to think about. And this is where our own particular cultural worldview becomes really important because that's what provides us with shared beliefs about reality that provide answers to basic questions about life, standards for valued behavior, and basically the promise of either literal or some kind of symbolic immortality if we live up to those stated standards.
Yeah, religion is how humans have sort of developed a way to cope with these issues of mortality and immortality. And literal immortality beliefs provide some hope that life will continue after our physical death. Um, you know, as exemplified by things like afterlife concepts of heaven, reincarnation, or joining with ancestral spirits.
Right. And then there's notions of symbolic immortality that comes from contributing to something greater than oneself, that somehow we will continue long after we have died by some kind of contribution. It might be having a family, being part of a nation, the memories of other people, or something, concrete that we've left behind.
Yeah, but relationships too are an important part of this. Our close relationships tend to validate our own worldviews. Self-esteem is also a part. This is a sense of personal value that results from believing that we're living up to the standards of our own cultural worldview. And our close relationships provide validation of those worldviews and help reinforce our self-esteem, the self-esteem that we need to maintain confidence in those values. As well as, those relationships provide security for us in their own right.
Yeah, there was the work of terror management theory is grounded in the work of a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker. And he wrote a really groundbreaking book in 1973. It was called The Denial of Death. And in his work, he really looked at the psychological and philosophical implications of how people and cultures have reacted to the inevitability of death. He believed that most human action is taken to try to ignore or avoid that reality. He believed that every person's character is essentially formed around the process of denying that we are going to die, and that it's a component, a necessary component of just being able to function in the world. And he called it character or armor, that this character armor masks and keeps us from actually having more accurate knowledge about ourselves. And later, in a later book called Escape from Evil, which came out in 1975, he asserted that he thought most of the evil in the world was a consequence of the need to deny death.
So, terror management theory, we also refer to it as TMT, was really strongly influenced by this work. And terror management theory is the study of how humans cope not with the imminent threat of extermination, not only that, but with the awareness that this threat exists all the time. And eventually it will succeed, right? We eventually will die. And terror management theory examines the impact that this awareness of the inevitability of death has on how we live our lives. It highlights the vital role of culture and the institutions that support that culture, how much they play a role in protecting us from that awareness. So, really to assist us in constructing beliefs about the nature of reality that might mitigate the horror and dread of what will inevitably confront in the form of death.
Yeah, what the TMT research has shown is that all cultural worldviews serve an important anxiety serving function by having a shared meaning and purpose in a whole systematic way as a way of achieving either symbolic or literal immortality. Becker wrote this. He said, psychologically, then, the function of culture is not to illuminate the truth, but rather to obscure the horrifying possibility that death entails the permanent annihilation of the self. And that helps us understand why any disturbance in any culture that we are affiliated with, that we identify with, including an organizational culture, arouses anxiety that is not it's not necessarily commensurate, the level of anxiety, with the actual change that is being required or being asked for. And in fact, what TMT says is you don't have to threaten death. You can just kind of subtly bring up the notion that we are not immortal. And that's enough to raise people's anxiety outside of their conscious awareness.
Yeah, and cultural reality, like both organizationally and socially, it's really fragile and it can be pretty easily disturbed. Like you were saying, all it takes is sort of a suggestion that heightens our awareness of our own mortality. Um, and we're being confronted with that reality all the time. The research literature uses the term, and you mentioned this earlier, mortality salience. And we're really vulnerable to this mortality salience because our modern communication systems really expose us 24 hours a day to news, to, instant information, instant communication that we get bombarded with. And there, a lot of those communications are reminders that terrible things happen to people who are pretty much just like us.
And social media has escalated that so much. So you are right. It is 24/7 for a lot of people. And the cultural ideas and values are also constantly being disturbed by what are seemingly incompatible ideas and values arising from people from different culture, particularly in this melting pot, this diverse environment that is the United States. And the result of that is the anxiety buffer that culture represents can really be easily threatened, as we're seeing on the campaign trail, right? The use of that threat by a diversity of ideas and opinions and worldviews and lifestyles that really represent a multicultural society.
Terror management theory hypothesizes that human awareness of our inevitable finality of death, it creates the potential for existential terror. And that's largely controlled in two different ways. The first is faith in an internalized cultural worldview. And the second is self esteem, which is attained by living up to the standards or values that's prescribed by that worldview.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research now in TMT, and it has demonstrated that when the fear of death or mortality salience is triggered, even outside of conscious awareness, people tend to become more fearful, less tolerant, more prejudiced, more socially conservative, more supportive of leaders who support their worldview, more fundamentalist, and more punitive toward anyone who is disrupting or threatening to disrupt their worldview. And I really think that has to date been experimented on in over 300 experiments and conducted in 15 different countries. And I think people now on the campaign trail are deliberately using that research to determine what they say and how they say it.
Yeah, to really inspire that response. And activate the coping mechanisms that are aligned with that response, all of which are about becoming more conservative and relying more heavily on authoritarianism. um, but terror management theory also posits that this buffering system, right, that we have the ability to manage those reactions with our cultural worldviews, self-esteem, and close relationships. And these buffers mitigate that existential terror by kind of creating a sense that I'm a person of value living in a meaningful world, right? That's kind of the stabilizing factor against the terror management response.
Yeah. And the biggest problem, really, that we're facing now is that as our whole society has been becoming more conservative and more punitive toward any other ideas and more fundamentalist, it makes it less likely that as a group we will make the significant changes that we need to make the certainty of premature death less certain, given climate change, given what is going to happen.
Yeah, there's this whole, psychological process that happens that sort of unfolds to that allows this, right? Because it's illogical when we think about it. If we're trying to apply logic, we're seeing like our behavior is not aligned with keeping us alive. Um, and so terror management theory sort of supports this whole network of converging hypotheses. One thing is that reminders of death or that mortality salience increases commitment to our worldview, our self esteem, and our relationships, and increases our defense of these things when we feel threatened. Right. To me, it sort of reminds me of when someone who's not religious at all finds a loved one, is sick and begins praying, right? So sort of doing the, kind of worldview grasping. That is kind of how I would describe it. The second is bolstering self esteem, worldview, or relationships makes us less prone to anxiety and anxiety related behavior in response to threats. So we know that these three things are really effective buffers. Threats to our worldview, our self esteem, and relationships increase the accessibility of death related thoughts. So anytime these three buffers are disrupted, our mind is more likely to wander towards these thoughts of death and increase that anxiety. And then self esteem, striving, cultural worldview defense, or affirming close relationships in response to mortality salience can reduce the accessibility of those death thoughts, and the need for further terror management defenses. And this suggests that these three components, these anxiety buffers, are psychologically interchangeable. So we can use any or all three of them in the same way effectively.
And this helps to explain why changes, even in organizational culture, can be so disoriented and so strongly resisted by staff members, even when the changes are in their own interest. If we control this fundamental existential terror that's just part of being a human being, largely through faith in whatever our cultural worldview is and our own self-esteem, then whenever either or both is threatened, then it unleashes these terrors. And incorporating knowledge about the traumatic experiences that we know now underlie most child and adult psychopathology, as well as chronic physical problems, is terribly threatening to the existing worldview and the mental models upon which human service delivery is built, firmly built, and
Yeah,
has been for a long time.
people in all kinds of varieties of human service sectors, they deal day in and day out with an army of people who've been the victims of largely preventable social problems. Psychologically injured children and adults fill our homeless and domestic violence shelters, acute care, psychiatric units, psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment centers, group homes, foster care agencies, juvenile justice systems, jails, prisons. The list goes on.
And the closer we are to loss, trauma, and the specter of death, the greater the mortality salience, and therefore the more powerful a role these automatic and let's underscore unconscious defenses will play in any environment, doesn't matter what it is. In treatment environments where the causes of the client's problems lie in this tragic nature of human existence, the greater the likelihood that even the people who are supposed to be helping them will instead, consciously or unconsciously, blame the victims to distance themselves from what has actually happened to these folks. But understanding the complex problems that develop as a result of exposure to trauma and childhood adversity and disrupted attachment helps us. It's really the only thing that helps us to make sense of many of the dynamics that we see in individual clients and families.
Yeah, many of us come into our roles in human service work with our own stories of trauma and experiences of adversity. And we bring these with us into the workplace. So then when things happen in the workplace, it's really easy to slip into the victim role, to feel powerless, hopeless, or helpless. And our growing understanding about neurobiology, specifically the neurobiology of stress and traumatic stress, has really fundamentally changed everything about how we think about the work that we do. Now we really understand our primary role is to change the trajectory for the people that we serve.
Yeah, because the reality is that many of the children and adults that we work with have suffered really terrible injuries and horrible events. And those who have not been abused or neglected have lived in a world that has been quite unkind. All of them have learned that the world is not a very safe place and that they have often felt misunderstood and mistreated. And we know now that these experiences, as you've been alluding to, have been etched on their brains when they were very young. And we know that traditional treatment approaches, at least those that have been based on coercion and control, serve only to make those channels deeper and reinforce established dysfunctional patterns. And then all too often we come to work and a crisis occurs. And what happens then? Well, there's a centralization of control with leaders tightening reins, concentrating power at the top, and minimizing participatory decision-making processes. And that occurs even when there are strong beliefs in the democratic ways of life. There's always a tendency in institutions and in the larger containing society, which is what we have to worry about now, to regress to simple hierarchical models of authority as a way of preserving an elusive sense of security and stability. And this is not just a phenomenon of leadership. In times of great uncertainty, everyone in an institution or in a society colludes to collectively bring into being authoritarian organizations as a time-honored method for providing at least the illusion of greater certainty and therefore a diminution of anxiety.
Yeah, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Terror management theory in the experimental studies shows that reminding people of their own mortality enhances and strengthens their existing worldview, their religious beliefs, their group identifications, their tendency to cling to charismatic leaders. I love zombies and zombie shows, Sandy, and this reminds me so much of The Walking Dead, right? That whole universe. So many of the groups are, there's this threat to life, and the person who emerges to lead the group is just an absolute nightmare. And
Yep.
it makes sense evolutionarily, and we see it in our pop culture shows, and historically in all kinds of literature, as well as real life history. But when danger's real and present, effective leaders take charge and give commands that are obeyed by obedient followers. And that really harnesses and directs that combined power of many individuals in service of group survival. Fear-provoking circumstances within an organization are contagious. And before, when you were saying, like, when a crisis happens in your organization, I was realizing, like, sometimes I'm the crisis that comes into an organization. when I show up for our coaching, in the beginning, and I'm like, we're going to make some changes and we're going to do this thing differently. That creates that feeling of threat, because change initiates the mortality salience. And, um, you know, I see the results of that. And we'll talk more about that in our next segment. But within a group, emotional contagion occurs almost instantly. And predictable group responses are likely to emerge then automatically.
Yep. Because threatened groups tend to increase group attachment with each other and are more likely to be drawn to leaders who appear really confident, even arrogant, take control, and are willing to tell other people what to do. Interpersonal conflict decreases within the group, while the threatening person or group becomes dehumanized. They are labeled as being less than human. And then everyone pulls together toward the common goal of making sure my group survives, producing what really can be experienced by everyone in the group as this wonderful state of oneness and unity. leading to a willingness to even sacrifice one's own life for the sake of the group. And this is a survival strategy, ensuring that in a state of crisis, decisions can be made quickly and efficiently, and makes it more likely that somebody in the group will survive while there may be lots of individuals who are sacrificed in the process.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of this research came up and out around the time of 9/11, the terrorist attacks. And I mean, I think you said before too, it makes so much sense because what the terrorist attacks did was to disrupt our normal means of managing our natural terror, our natural death salience. And in doing that, it threatened to undermine what we call the psychological equanimity, right? The balance necessary for people to function effectively on a daily basis. It was all of a sudden right there in our faces. And that explains so much about what it feels like a really unbalanced approach to the political situation in this country that's persisted for the last 20 something years.
Yeah, and one of the most consistent findings from the TMT research has been that reminding Americans of their mortality increases the positivity of their reactions to anybody or anything that praises America, and the negativity of their reactions to anyone or anything that criticizes America. So it wasn't just an accident that after 9/11, we went and attacked another country, and not the country that had actually
Yeah,
had
attacked us.
actually done it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So yeah, these are big forces that are largely unconscious.
So we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about some of the ways that individuals and organizations can protect themselves from death salience and look at some organizational and individual behaviors that we have suggested in our work with creating presence. We'll be back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. We're going to continue our discussion about TMT, terror management theory, and strategies for disrupting the potential for upending our psychological equanimity. So it's worth remembering in this regard the words of William James. He said, "The world we see that seems so insane is the result of a belief system that is not working. To perceive the world differently, we must be willing to change our belief system, let the past slip away, expand our sense of now, and dissolve the fear in our minds." And then there's also the words of Rajneesh as well. He said, "Anybody who gives you a belief system is your enemy, because the belief system becomes the barrier for your eyes and you cannot see the truth."
I love that. It makes me sort of think about taking this leap from our last segment that focused so much on individual and collective responses to our death awareness. Um, that I see in organizations when we help them implement trauma-informed practice with creating presence. I was joking before that like I am the crisis that comes in because talking about change, even when it's positive change, it heightens our awareness of our own mortality. And I think in some ways too, the mortality of our organizations or our systems, it serves as a reminder that they may not be permanent either. And that really invokes fear. So, adopting creating presence can actually invoke a response that leads people to do the opposite of what we hope for in the beginning, right? This changes, but it's not uncommon to see people get more fearful, less tolerant, more prejudiced, more socially conservative, more supportive of leaders who support their worldview, more fundamentalist, or more punitive towards people who are disrupting their worldview. Again, that would be me. Um, and so I've sort of learned to expect that that might be an initial reaction.
And then there are particular events in organizations that tend to activate this response. We've frequently seen that happen as a result of financial crisis, definitely downsizing, or program extension, and not just program extension, but programs that have to integrate with other programs, leadership changes. All of these create the most significant kind of death-denying behaviors. So we've come to understand how important it is to have some established norms, in addition to the values that the organization has, to buffer these kinds of changes, which are not infrequently traumatic changes. So we find it's really important and helpful to have an organization be clear about their value statement, and that the value statement includes references to trauma-informed or trauma-responsive practice. Even though value statements are really more aspirational than practical, they serve a really helpful purpose as a reminder to the whole community about connection. And they create some kinds of guardrails for the organization.
Yeah, another formal practice is to distribute an organizational chart. Now, everyone's got one of those at their organization. But what we find is really helpful too is to articulate the norms about navigating the hierarchy or seeking help so that people know who they can go to and what the expectations are around access to power and information. And we do this in creating presence through a practice of kind of identifying team strengths so that it's lateral as well, not just kind of where do you go in the hierarchy, but how do you connect with people who are your peers. Another example of a norm that creates some buffering is the use of the self framework to organize supervision. And this offers an opportunity for staff members to use their one on one time with their supervisors to focus on categories of likely dysfunction, right? We know that trauma disrupts our ability to maintain safety, emotion regulation, loss, managing grief and loss, and thinking about the future. So, using this format that creating presence applies allows us to use those four categories, but also to look at what's happening at the client level, what's happening with the individual staff member, and what's happening at the organizational level in those four areas. So, using that protocol can be really helpful in raising awareness of fears, loss, and grief reactions, and also the behavior that might be resulting from those emotional reactions.
And then we also work with organizations to develop internal communications protocols, because both formal channels and informal communication channels are opportunities for reaching out or checking in and up and down the organizational hierarchy, as well as what people do with their own peers. We also focus a lot of energy on establishing communication expectations and protocols, because when emotional intensity increases, then our death-denying behaviors are likely to influence us. And that includes information hoarding or secrecy. Yeah, you got to keep this quiet. Generating ongoing regular communication patterns about larger organizational issues, as well as things like who's leaving, who got a new job, what's changing, in supervision can serve as a type of kind of exposure work for staff. And that exposure work can help normalize the flow of expected change within a system and decrease then the reactivity when these changes actually happen or are abrupt or unexpected.
Yeah, this idea of doing exposure work by keeping communication open and helping people regulate their emotional responses, in times when the stakes are lower, really helps us when the stakes are higher. And another way of doing that we build into creating presence is the incident response protocol. So we always ask our organizations to look at their incident response protocol. Like, what do you do? What are the steps that are supposed to be taken when something goes wrong, when there's a critical incident that requires intervention? And we ask two questions. The first is there a restorative component, right? Are you just, firing the person who did the thing or, ejecting them from the program? Or are you also looking at how to restore a sense of safety? Because that part is really critical. And then the second question is, how do you manage the feedback loops around people who were involved in the critical incident, including witnesses or bystanders? So, we want to really encourage a trauma-informed response that happens every time there's an incident that requires some intervention, so that staff members and leaders alike are better able to use that kind of practice to inform their communication and their management on larger scale issues. So, to use these as practice or as exposure to then be able to buffer the negative effects of a potentially traumatizing change.
A second strategy is a mental health and vicarious trauma prevention skill that we use in creating presence with what we call meaning-making engagement. This is a practice of attuning to our own awareness internally and rationally as a way of buffering the effects of terror management. When you become aware of a significant change in your organization that activates the terror response, doing this reflective exercise can be really a helpful mitigator. When we begin the process of implementing trauma and trauma-informed practice with creating presence, often staff members experience what we've been describing, that survival-related terror response that results then in avoidance or rejection of very similar to the fight-flight response. They just don't want to do it. Using meaning-making engagement around each of our own professional identity means connecting with the larger sense of belonging and recognizing that being part of the whole might require resolving some conflicts with some questions.
Yeah, the questions are basically, how have I been trained? How have I been working? How do I see my value? And what's been expected of me up to this point? And doing this meaning making process can really help mitigate that reflexive fight or flight response to the idea of change. And I'm not proud of it, but Sandy, when you started working with my team 25 years ago, I definitely had like a very avoidant response. I was like, "Uh-oh, what does this mean?" But when I think back to that time and really reflect on like, okay, how was I trained? I recognized I was trained as a psychodynamic therapist. So my worldview was, individual therapeutic relationship is the primary vehicle for recovery. And I had to really recognize the conflict between how I saw myself as the provider of the clinical work, kind of the owner, I think, of the clinical work, And what you were teaching us and our team about how the team is really the delivery system for the clinical work. It's the milieu. I was working in a residential treatment center at that time. So really kind of evaluating the conflict in my training and just articulating that and recognizing it for myself helped bring some of my anxiety down. How I'd been working, right? I was really comfortable working very independently and with the assumption that I would be seen sort of as the expert who shaped the course of treatment. My value, what I thought I was bringing to the work was as an, expert in this work and clinical work. And now I was going to have to really sort of shift that to think about what other ways I would bring value. And what I learned and what I sort of thought about was I was going to get to be a leader in a way I hadn't been a leader before and a facilitator in my team because of that expertise. And I really like that role. It's kind of what I'm doing now. And it sort of takes the pressure off to think of yourself more as facilitator of the treatment rather than as kind of the prescriber of the treatment. And then, what was expected. So for me, it was to generate and carry out a treatment plan that I had mostly constructed in my own head. But what it was going to be was incorporate the voices and perspectives of other people in the design and execution, and really kind of handing some of that over to other people on my team. And it took a little bit of work to navigate those conflicts and what had been, between what had been and what was going to be. But because I could then buffer my response of avoidance, I was able to go through that process. And now, 25 years later, here I am with you teaching other people how to do it.
Right. And as you know, my experience with all of this predates by about 15 years, gets more like 40 years ago, having to come to terms with this. And I remember us as a team just being staggered by how could this be possible? How could there be this many people in our society, in this basically what was an all-white middle class environment, that have abused their kids? How could that be possible? What is this about the world, and how tempting it was to deny the reality of all that? How easy it would have been to just say, "Oh, it's a fantasy. They're just making it up. It's not real. That stuff didn't really happen to them." And because the recognition of all kinds of abuse that were happening, it was just coming into the world. We didn't have a lot of research about that. Now we do. And I think that's part of how hard it's been to get trauma-informed knowledge really in the world and into the general public, is that there's a built-in kind of resistance, because trauma equals fear equals death or the threat of death. And so it gets rejected really easily. And I felt the temptation of that back in the day. And then after a while, we couldn't deny it anymore. It was only too real, and we had to figure out how to adapt to it and how to respond to it in ways that's why we use the term trauma responsive, right? But
Yeah.
I think that's part of why there's such a lot of talk now about resilience and resiliency,
Hmm.
because it's a way of trying to counteract what automatically comes up as a result of talking about trauma. Although I would have to say I prefer the concept of post-traumatic growth.
Yes. Well, and I was thinking as you were talking, I was like, well, you're better than Freud, Sandy, because you were willing to shift your worldview, right? He actually encountered the same information. And instead, he was like, no, 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 this can't be right. All of these young women can't possibly have been sexually abused. So it must be a problem with them psychologically. And so, Freudian theory developed from there. But I think it says so much about how holding on to our current worldview is so it's such a powerful drive for us because it does diminish our terror about impending death. So it makes sense. It makes so much sense. But we also do this meaning making um, engagement practice at the organizational level, and sort of thinking about some of the uh, kind of questions or conversations that need to happen there too.
So, having conversations with teams around meaning making engagement with the organization includes discussing the fact that, change is not easy, it will be uneven, and the unevenness can be expected. Often, this uneven change results in confusion or all kinds of cognitive distortions about fairness and who gets priority and who's getting attention, and it just can be reframed as just a normal part of organizational learning. Conversations about the opportunities for role modeling are also part of the conversation. Having individual members of the team volunteer responsibility for piloting or trying a particular skill out, and then sharing what has happened to them, reporting back to the rest of the team can be quite useful.
Yeah, this idea of meaning making engagement within the organization is really about kind of normalizing the process of change. And so having those conversations about, trying things out and piloting are really helpful. But I also find that a conversation around distinguishing between advocating and complaining is really helpful too. Um, and so with groups, I really try to focus on kind of explaining that the advocating and complaining are kind of similar they're under the same umbrella, but there are some significant distinctions with regard to blaming and responsibility. So advocating is making suggestions, kind of leading with suggestions that also include you as the person who's making suggestions, right? Not making them for others only to follow, and really kind of doing that without assigning blame. Um, Complaining is leading with blame and leading with responsibility for your suggestions landing on other people outside of you. And so that's a pretty significant distinction that I think is worth having when we're talking about integrating change, because everybody's willing to ask everybody else to do the change work, but if it's their fault.
So true.
The
Oh
other
yeah, the
is meaning making
complainers. Mm.
engagement with each other. And this is a conversation that includes discussions about recognizing how like individual availability for learning and self-reflection is going to ebb and flow. So when we are working in a team, the change process is going to be uneven for each individual member of that team. And some of us, might grab onto an idea and it feels right and we can go with it pretty quickly. For others, that integration process or processing is going to be at a different pace. So change might happen in spurts with some progression, but the hope is that, the trend or the trajectory is forward motion overall, but not necessarily in kind of an even uh, pace.
And we also, in this process, discuss the importance of practicing emotional professionalism, recognizing that emotions are expected, they're welcome, but how these emotions actually manifest and what we actually do should align with standards of professionalism. And finally, meaning making engagement with each other requires really committing to curiosity rather than making assumptions about what we're seeing in the process of change, asking about what we're seeing or experiencing, and being open to answers or explanations that really might not fit our own personal worldview.
Yeah, and that's really hard to do because clinging to our worldview is biologically, neurologically wired. So, a third strategy that we want to talk about is was suggested by our friend Kathy Van Horn. She is a licensed psychologist and the executive vice president of Lakeside. She's the founder and director of Neurologic by Lakeside. And she was a guest in our first season of this podcast. So, she is really talking about kind of the healing power of human connections. And she's drawing on some work by a researcher named Murthy, who authored an article or a book called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And also kind of looking at factors for mortality, a meta-analytic review. That was published in 2010. So she was thinking about these things, as were we.
Yeah, and really good guidelines when we were talking about those guidelines that programs need. So devoting time each day for building relationships, greeting coworkers and the people you serve by name, modeling kindness even when someone is being disrespectful to you, showing grace and forgiveness when somebody makes a mistake, admitting when you make a mistake and making time to apologize, allowing time for yourself to talk to other people in appropriate ways during the workday through relational brain breaks, like during staff meetings, allowing time to get together with coworkers to support each other and just have a good time. Remembering that relationships take time and need care throughout the year. They're easy to damage, and at times you'll need to do repair work. So the way you respond to one person harshly impacts not only them, but others in the room if your reaction has been a harsh one.
Yeah, she also notes that those who struggle with relationships will need more time and effort on your part. They need more repetitions of positive interactions to trust and connect. And so she suggests that we don't give up on them. And that some people will push your limits to see if you'll give up on them, as others have in their pasts. And they are testing you in some ways. So don't give up on them either.
Kathy says it's important to remember that our regulation and stress levels can negatively impact our relationships. So add to your list ways to take care of yourself. The positive relationships we form are an important aspect of taking care of ourselves. These relationships will increase our job satisfaction and our job success and will be a buffer to us in times of stress and distress.
Yeah, great words from our buddy Kathy. So thank you so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.